Tonight, we are stepping through one of the most iconic structures in all of human history, the medieval castle. And we are doing from a one angle that almost no one ever thinks about. Not the lord in his solar, not the lady in her bower, not the knights in the courtyard with their gleaming armor and their vigorous sense of purpose. Tonight, we are talking about the servants. And before we go even a single sentence further, I need to say something important. Almost everything that popular culture has taught you about what it meant to be a castle servant in the medieval period is, at minimum, incomplete, and at maximum, almost entirely made up. Films give you a very particular vision. There is usually a cheerful maid carrying a candle through a spotless corridor. There is a cook who produces somehow perfect food from a kitchen that appears to be the size of a broom closet and contains exactly one pot. There is a stable boy who occasionally has a significant plot moment. Everyone has clean faces. The castle smells like candle wax and wood polish, which is a remarkable achievement considering medieval people didn't have wood polish and had very strong feelings about the frequency of bathing. The reality of medieval castle service was something far more physical, far more complicated, far more hierarchically rigid, and, in its own peculiar way, far more fascinating. These were real people. They had names. They had ranks within the household that governed nearly every aspect of their existence, from what they ate, to where they slept, to who was allowed to speak to them first in the morning. They worked hours that would make a modern employment lawyer weep into their coffee. They navigated a social world of extraordinary intricacy, in which the wrong gesture, the wrong word, the wrong failure to appear in the right doorway at precisely the right moment could result in consequences ranging from a sharp reprimand to an immediate loss of position. And they knew the castle, really knew it, in a way that no lord or visiting dignitary ever could. They knew which flagstone near the south wall sweated moisture in autumn. They knew which chimney drew badly when the wind came from the east. They knew where the mice got in, and which cat was actually useful about it, and which cat simply regarded the mice as colleagues. Tonight, we spent a full day and night walking in their shoes, which were, incidentally, not very comfortable. If you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive historical journey, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It is a genuinely meaningful way to support this kind of work, and it means more of these quiet, detailed stories can keep being made for you. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city, your country, your little corner of the world into the comments. There is something genuinely warm about knowing that people are settling in for an evening of medieval history from so many different places all at once. Now, let us attend to the important business. Find a comfortable position. Pull your blanket up. Dim the lights if you haven't already. The to-do list is finished for tonight. The phone can wait. The only thing that needs to happen right now is exactly this. Let the story begin. We're going back, not to a clean cinematic version of the past, but to the real thing, cold stone and wood smoke, and the specific ache of a body that has worked since before sunrise. The time is approximately the mid-14th century, roughly the 1350s, in a large English noble household. The castle is real in the sense that thousands like existed, scattered across the landscape, each one a small, self-contained world with its own economics, its own politics, its own complicated social order. You are a servant, and your day is about to begin before you are remotely ready for it. The bell rings in the darkness, and your body knows before your mind does that the night is over. You've been asleep on a straw-filled pallet near the base of the Great Hall's eastern wall, somewhere between the remains of last night's fire and a pile of equipment that someone left out and hasn't been moved in 3 days. The fire is mostly ash now, though a few orange embers breathe faintly in the dark. The room smells of wood smoke, of the rush matting on the floor of dog. There are at least 4 dogs sleeping near what used to be the warmest part of the hearth, and of the lingering ghost of last night's evening meal, which was some kind of pottage with onions and the memory of salted fish. The temperature in the hall is somewhere between uncomfortable and actively discouraging. Medieval castle walls, for all their extraordinary thickness, some measured 4 to 8 feet through the stone, were not designed with interior warmth as a primary concern. They were designed to resist an assault. This they accomplished magnificently. What they also accomplished, without any effort whatsoever, was the absorption and retention of cold. In winter, the stone walls of a large castle could stay cold to the touch well into morning even after the fires have been burning for hours. Your body, pressed against one of them through the night, is intimately familiar with this quality. You are wearing your clothes. You slept in your clothes. This is not unusual. This is not even considered particularly strange. Most people in this period slept in at least their undergarments, and servants sleeping in a communal hall often slept in a full day's lair or close to it, partly for warmth and partly because the alternative, undressing, folding your clothes, placing them somewhere, lying down on a cold stone floor, was a sequence of events that required a level of optimism about your morning that almost no one in your position possessed. You sit up. The movement disturbs one of the hall dogs, who lifts his head, examines you with a deeply unimpressed expression of an animal who has decided you are not interesting, and goes back to sleep. The wisdom there is almost envious. On the floor around you, other bodies are beginning to stir. The lower household servants, the pages and grooms and kitchen helpers, and the various young men who perform the running and fetching and carrying functions of castle life, slept here in a hall in large numbers. In a very grand household, there might be 40 or 50 people who slept in the hall on any given night. In a smaller but still substantial castle, you might share the space with 15 or 20 others. Personal space was not a medieval concept that anyone had put into writing yet. You scratch your arm. This is a reflex, not a decision. The fleas are a constant presence in the sleeping arrangements of virtually everyone in the medieval period, regardless of rank. Those servants who slept in communal straw-strewn spaces had somewhat more animated encounters with them than, say, the lord of the castle sleeping in his private chamber on a proper mattress stuffed with wool rather than straw. Herbal sachets. Pennyroyal was particularly popular, as was wormwood and lavender, were used to discourage fleas from taking up permanent residence. Flea combs, found in archaeological digs across medieval Europe from England to Scandinavia, were everyday household items. The herbal sachets and flea combs did not defeat the fleas. They negotiated a kind of uneasy détente that satisfied no one, least of all the fleas. You stand up. The floor is cold to the thin soles of your shoes, which you also slept in because the alternative was standing barefoot on a stone floor at 4 a.m, and that is the kind of experience that converts people to a barefoot lifestyle for approximately 30 seconds before they convert back immediately. You take stock of yourself in the way that a person does when they have learned, through long experience, that their body is not always their ally in the early morning hours. The cold has settled into your joints during the night in the way that cold does when you sleep on stone and wake before the fire is properly revived. Your lower back carries a particular opinion of a body that has done heavy physical work for years and has decided to share that opinion with you at this specific moment. Your shoulder, the one that has bothered you since the incident with the cart last autumn, announces itself with a brief, familiar protest. You note all of this the way you note whether present, documented, not a reason to stop. Someone ahead of you is already moving toward the great door with a tallow candle, a small orange flame casting a lurching yellow light across the sleeping bodies on the floor. Tallow candles, rendered animal fat, were a common light source for servants and lower household members. They gave reasonable light and a distinctive smell that anyone who has ever forgotten a candle is burning in a closed room would find immediately recognizable. Beeswax candles, which burn cleaner and smell pleasantly of honey, were reserved for the upper household, the chapel, and important occasions. This is the medieval period's way of reminding you, through the medium of candle chemistry, exactly where you stand. The morning is beginning. It will not wait for you to be ready. And this, right here, at 4 a.m. with cold flagstones and flea bites and the smell of old wood smoke, is where the story of a medieval castle servant's day actually starts. Not in the kitchen, not in the hall at breakfast. Here, in the dark, before most of the world has any idea the day has begun. But before we follow the day forward, let's take a moment to understand the physical world you are moving through, because the castle itself is one of the most important things that shapes every single hour of a servant's life. A medieval castle is not one building. This is the first thing to understand, and it is something that almost everyone who has not studied the subject gets slightly wrong. When people picture a medieval castle, they tend to picture a single imposing tower on a hill, or perhaps a square kept surrounded by a curtain wall. These images are accurate for certain types of castles in certain periods. But by the mid-14th century, the large working noble households that we are interested in tonight had typically developed into something considerably more complex, a collection of interconnected buildings, courtyards, ranges, towers, gatehouses, and ancillary structures that together formed a small, largely self-contained community. Inside the curtain wall, or in many cases inside multiple nested rings of walls, you would typically find the Great Hall, which was the social and administrative heart of the household. You would find the lord's private apartments, called the solar, positioned usually at the upper end of the hall for both warmth and symbolic elevation. You would find a chapel, because religious observance was woven into the daily schedule of a medieval household in a way that no modern institution quite parallels. You would find kitchens, which in a large household were substantial, purpose-built structures positioned at a careful distance from the main residential buildings to reduce fire risk. Medieval people were not naive about the consequences of having your food preparation happen in the same building as your sleeping arrangements. You would find storerooms, armories, stables, barns, gardens, wells, latrines, and a bewildering variety of specialized spaces for specialized functions. This is the world you navigate every day. And you navigate it largely on foot, largely carrying things. The architecture of a castle creates a daily experience for servants that is simultaneously more intimate and more exhausting than it appears from the outside. The staircases in castle towers, called newel stairs or spiral staircases, wind in a clockwise direction as you ascend. This is a deliberate defensive design, giving a right-handed defender descending the stair the advantage of a free sword arm, while the attacker ascending faces a stone core of the newel. This is fine for knights. For servants carrying heavy loads up these narrow, winding, unlit staircases, water, firewood, food, bed linen, chamber pots, it is a daily reminder that the building was not designed with your comfort as a primary consideration. The stone floors are cold. The stone walls radiate cold. The small windows in serving corridors, those that exist at all, are covered in oiled linen rather than glass, letting in a filtered gray light that does the minimum possible work before giving up. In summer, the castle can be genuinely pleasant. The thick walls that punish you in winter work the other way in July, keeping the interior cool while the countryside outside bakes. Servants sometimes noted this in their personal accounts. The summer was the brief season when the castle's architectural logic worked in your favor, and you appreciated it accordingly, knowing it wouldn't last. The privies, called garderobes, a name derived from the French for wardrobe, because the ammonia fumes from the latrine pit were believed to repel moths and insects, which tells you something about medieval multi-purpose thinking, were typically recessed into the thickness of the outer walls or projected out from towers, with a stone shaft dropping to a pit or, in coastal and river castles, directly into the water below. There were not enough of them. In a large castle household of 50 to 100 people, there might be 4 or 5 garderobes accessible to the general household, and during peak morning activity they were, to put it diplomatically, busy places. The job of cleaning the garderobe shafts fell to a specific category worker who was paid somewhat more than his contemporaries, which seems both fair and insufficient in equal measure. Water in the castle came primarily from the well in the courtyard, from rain catchment systems, or from streams redirected through underground channels. There was no running water in the modern sense. Every drop of water used for cooking, for drinking, for washing, for brewing, for cleaning, for laundry, for the Lord's morning ablutions, every single drop was carried by hand from its source to wherever it needed to be. This is not a small thing. Water is heavy. A full wooden bucket weighs roughly 20 pounds. Carrying 2 of them up a spiral stone staircase to fill a lord's washing basin at 6 in the morning is an activity that builds a very particular kind of physical capability over time. Medieval servants were not weak people. The evidence of their skeletons, where it survives, shows significant musculoskeletal development consistent with heavy repetitive manual labor. This is the archaeology of people who spent their lives carrying things upstairs. You know every inch of this castle. You know where the draft comes from in the south passage. You know which step in the kitchen stair is slightly lower than the others, and will catch your foot if you're not paying attention. You know that the water in the east well tastes faintly of iron after a heavy rain. You know these things because your life has given you no choice but to learn them. And now it is time to get dressed, which is Admittedly, mostly already done. Servant clothing in the medieval period was functional in a way that went well beyond the concept of dressing for work. What you wore was literally an announcement of who you were, what your rank was, and which household you belonged to. It was, in the absence of name tags, a complete identification system rendered in fabric. The basic garment for a male servant was a tunic, a woolen garment that fell to somewhere between the knee and mid-thigh depending on the fashion of the moment and the generosity of your employer. Beneath it you wore a linen shirt, which in the hierarchy of medieval textiles functioned as underwear. It went directly against the skin, was washed more frequently than the outer garments, and was usually the item you slept in if you took anything off at all. Wool does not enjoy being washed frequently. Linen does. Medieval people understood the properties of their textiles with the practical intimacy of people who had been making and maintaining fabric by hand for their entire lives. Your outer tunic was likely provided by your lord. This was called livery, and it was one of the economic relationships that defined service in the medieval period. Livery did not just mean clothing. It was a formal arrangement by which a noble household provided its servants with clothing, food, drink, and lodging in exchange for labor and loyalty. The quality of the livery told you your rank. The color of the livery told you whose household you belonged to. Traveling to another castle, you were immediately identifiable. Here is a servant of such and such a lord, in his colors, wearing his cloth. This had genuine social and legal implications. You were, in a real sense, wearing your affiliation on your body. The wool in your tunic was coarser than anything you would find in a modern clothing store. Medieval wool varied considerably in quality, and the finest English wool, which was a significant export commodity and part of why wool merchants became fabulously wealthy, went into the fine woven cloths called broadcloth that were produced for the upper-class market. What ended up in servant livery was serviceable, sturdy, and considerably more abrasive against the skin than a modern wool sweater. Somewhere in between a working garment and nature's version of very mild sandpaper. You had been wearing wool against your body for your entire life and had essentially stopped noticing it. The way you stopped noticing a particular smell in a room you've been in for 20 minutes. Your hose were knitted or cut in sewn wool, covering your legs and tied at the waist. Your shoes were tan leather with a thin sole and a relatively simple construction. They were not waterproof. When you stepped in a puddle, and there were puddles, many puddles, because the castle courtyard was not paved to any great depth, and the combination of horse traffic and foot traffic and occasional rain created conditions that would test modern drainage infrastructure. Your feet became wet. They stayed wet until the shoes dried, which they would do on your feet, because you wore them continuously. Medieval shoemakers' accounts and archaeological shoe remains show that people got considerable use out of their footwear before replacement, which is a polite way of saying that the shoes were generally in a state of moderate decline by the time they were replaced. Female servants wore a similar layered system, a linen chemise beneath a woolen kirtle, which was a fitted gown that laced or tied at the side. They covered their heads, typically with linen coif or wimple, because in medieval society, covered hair for women was a matter of social convention with deep roots in both religious and secular expectation. Unmarried young women might wear their hair covered with a simple linen cap. Married women kept it more fully covered. Working women in busy physical environments often wrapped and pinned their head coverings tightly for practical reason that loose cloth near kitchen fires, candle flames, or mechanical equipment could end a day very quickly and very dramatically. An upper-level servant, a lady's maid, a senior chamberlain, might have livery of noticeably higher quality, better woven wool, perhaps with a fur trim on the collar or cuffs, colors that were more expensive to dye. Color in medieval textiles was directly linked to cost. Red dye, particularly the true scarlet produced from an insect called kermes, was extraordinarily expensive. Deep blue from imported woad or weld. Rich greens, these saturated colors in good quality cloth, announce wealth with the certainty of a trumpet. A servant in plain russet or undyed natural wool announced something different but equally clear. You are now dressed. Effectively, you were dressed before you woke up, but the point stands, and the castle needs attending to. The first two tasks of every castle morning, tasks that had to be completed before any member of the upper household was expected to encounter the world, were lighting fires and hauling water. Both of these sound simple. Neither of them was. Fire in a medieval castle was not merely warmth. It was cooking, it was light, it was a primary technology by which the household sustained itself. In a large castle, there might be multiple fireplaces serving the great hall, the kitchen, the Lord's solar, the lady's bower, the chapel, and various other chambers. All of them needed to be laid and lit before the rooms were expected to be habitable. The servants responsible for this, often called, in various household account roles, the grooms of the chamber, or simply by the functional term fire layers, worked through the building in sequence, beginning with the most important rooms first. In the kitchen, the great hearth, a substantial open fireplace that might be 10 or 12 feet wide in a large castle kitchen, was the absolute priority. This fire could not be allowed to go out overnight if the next morning's work was to proceed on schedule, so a skilled kitchen servant would bank it carefully the previous evening, covering the coals with ash to slow combustion without extinguishing it. If it did go out, a failure that left a mark on the responsible person's professional reputation that took some time to recover from, a fresh fire had to be struck with flint and steel and tinder. The tinder, dried fungus called amadou, scraped from bracket fungi on trees or dried moss or charred linen cloth, needed to catch, and then to be coaxed from a spark into a flame with steady breath and careful management, and then transferred to kindling and then to larger wood. On a good morning, this took 5 minutes. On a cold, damp morning with slightly damp kindling and a fire layer who was tired and had scratched flea bites all night, it took considerably longer. The wood itself had to be brought in a large household. There would be a wood yard or a wood pile in one of the outer courts, and servants made regular trips to it, carrying armloads back to the various fireplaces. In winter, this was unambiguously the worst job in the early morning rotation. The wood was cold. Your hands were cold. The courtyard between the wood pile and the kitchen door was cold. The flagstones were sometimes icy. You made multiple trips. Once the fires were burning, water could be heated for the Lord and ladies' morning washing. Water for the upper household was typically heated in large iron cauldrons or copper vessels directly over the kitchen fire, then carried in smaller wooden buckets or ewers, handled jugs, to wherever it was needed. The Lord's bedchamber might require a full basin for washing, warm water for shaving if he was a shaving type, fashioned very considerably across the medieval period, from clean-shaven to vigorously bearded and back, and perhaps another basin for foot washing. All of this water arrived by human transport, up whatever staircase separated the kitchen from the Lord's private apartments. The servants who carried it had to move quickly enough that the water was still warm when it arrived, which meant that carrying hot water up spiral stone staircases in the dark was performed at a brisk pace. This was the kind of job that made people very sure-footed on uneven surfaces very quickly. Meanwhile, the courtyard itself needed attention. During the night, the horses in the stable produced their steady output of manure, which a groom cleared in the morning. The courtyard accumulated the various biological contributions of animals. And in a working castle, animals were everywhere. Horses for transport and war, cattle and pigs and chickens in the outer wards, hunting dogs in various buildings, the kitchen cat or cats. The grooms and lower outdoor servants made their rounds, and the courtyard by mid-morning was, if not exactly clean, at least presentable by the standard and era when livestock and people shared space as a matter of practical necessity. By the time all of this was done, the fires burning, the water heated and delivered, the principal rooms aired and tidy from the previous night, the upper household was just beginning to wake up. The servants had been working for 2 hours. This was, to use a technical term from economic history, uncompensated pre-productive labor. Though medieval accounting didn't call it that. Medieval accounting called it simply what the servants were for. And the morning had only just begun. Step into the kitchen of a large 14th century castle, and your first encounter is not visual. It is olfactory. The smell hits you before you cross the threshold. Wood smoke. Yes, always wood smoke, the permanent background note of medieval indoor life. But underneath that, the richer, denser smell of animal fat rendering in a pot, of yesterday's cooking still clinging to the walls and the ceiling and the enormous wooden table in the center of the room. There is a sharp acidic note of vinegar, used constantly as preservative and flavoring. There's the earthy, slightly swampy smell of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, rosemary, thyme, sage, mint, parsley, which had been drying there since summer, and had slowly infused the air with something that was half kitchen and half herbalist shop. And then there is the heat. Even in winter, the castle kitchen was warm almost to discomfort. The great hearth, now burning vigorously after its morning rekindling, threw heat outward in waves that you felt on your face from 5 feet away. In summer, the kitchen was something that medieval sources occasionally describe with a kind of exhausted understatement. Very hot appears in household accounts regarding working conditions with frequency that suggests the writers felt this covered it, and that modern occupational health standards would have very strong opinions about. The kitchen was a production hub of the entire castle. In a large noble household, it prepared food for potentially 100 people or more, the lord and lady and their immediate family, the upper household servants who ate in the hall, the lower servants who ate separately, and on feast days, a guest list that could expand the household's size dramatically and with relatively little warning. Medieval hospitality was a social obligation with deep roots in both Christian charity and aristocratic honor. You fed people. You fed everyone who came. The kitchen made this possible, and it did so under conditions that require extraordinary organizational capability from the cook and his staff. The cook, called the chief cook, or in Latin sources the coccus, was not a servant in the same sense as the lower kitchen workers. In a large household, the chief cook was a skilled professional who occupied a respected position in the household hierarchy, earned a notably better wage than most of the staff under him, and possessed knowledge of flavoring, preservation, and complex food preparation that was genuinely valuable. Cookbooks, or rather, recipe collections, since cookbook, as a term is a later development, survived from the medieval period, including the Famille of Cury, compiled in the late 14th century, reportedly by the master cooks of King Richard II, which gives us a remarkable window into what sophisticated medieval cookery actually looked like. It was considerably more complex and interesting than the popular image of boiled meat and turnips would suggest. Spice, sauce, elaborately flavored dishes using imported spices, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, nutmeg, saffron, were a remarkable, well-run aristocratic kitchen. Spices were expensive. This is worth pausing on. A pound of pepper in medieval England cost approximately the same as a full day's wages for a skilled laborer. Saffron, which had to be harvested from the stamens of crocus flowers by hand, cost more per pound than most servants earned in a month. The kitchen spice chest was kept under lock and key, managed by the cook or a senior officer, and the quantities used were carefully recorded in household accounts. The spice chest was not left unattended. This was not distrust of any particular individual. It was simply accurate accounting of expensive commodities, applied with a thoroughness of people who understood that spices were effectively currency in culinary form. Below the chief cook, the kitchen staff was organized in its own hierarchy. There were roasting boys, often the youngest kitchen workers, sometimes children as young as 10 or 11, whose job was to turn the spit over fire. This sounds simple. It was mind-numbing, physically demanding, and extremely hot work. The roasting spit, on which a joint of meat might be impaled and slowly turned for hours over the open fire, needed to be turned at a consistent rate to ensure even cooking. The child turning it, sometimes called a turnspit, sat or crouched near the fire for hours, turning the handle, enduring the heat, not stopping until the cook said to stop. Some wealthier kitchens in later periods developed mechanical spit-turning systems, using small dogs trained to run in a wheel, which powered the spit through a pulley mechanism. The dogs did not like this work either, but at least they left no written record of their feelings about it. There were scullions, the lowest kitchen workers, who washed pots and utensils, and performed the various cleaning tasks that kept the kitchen functional. The pots were large, heavy iron or copper vessels, and washing them without hot running water, using wood ash as an abrasive cleaning agent and a bucket of cold water from the courtyard well, was a task that occupied considerable time. There were pantlers who managed the bread supply. Bread was a fundamental food of the medieval period, the baseline caloric foundation of every meal from the lord's table to the servant's board. There were butlers, a word derived from bottler, keeper of the bottles, who managed the cellar and the wine and ale supply, which in a large household was a responsibility of genuine economic significance. All of these people worked in a space that was, by necessity, organized around the fire. Everything radiated outward from the hearth. The kitchen architecture of a large castle was designed to keep the fire burning efficiently and to allow maximum food production around it. The great central hearth for boiling and simmering, the side ovens for baking, the spits for roasting, the dripping pans below the spits for collecting animal fat that would be used for cooking, for candle making, for leather conditioning. Nothing was wasted. The medieval kitchen was a model of resource utilization that would earn genuine respect from a modern environmental engineer. Food preservation was a continuous operation that the kitchen managed alongside its daily production. Salting, the application of dry salt or immersion in brine, was a primary technology for keeping meat and fish through the winter months. The salting of the Martinmas livestock was a major autumn event, producing barrels of salted beef and pork that constituted a significant portion of the winter protein supply. Smoking over the fire, either in a purpose-built smokehouse or simply hung in the kitchen's upper spaces where the smoke gathered, added both flavor and preservation to meat and fish. Drying for fruits and some vegetables removed the moisture that bacterial and fungal decomposition required. Pickling in vinegar preserved vegetables through acid. The combination of these methods and the skill of knowing which food needed which treatment and for how long was genuine food science applied empirically by people who had no formal food science education, but a great deal of practical consequence if they got it wrong. The winter smell of a medieval castle kitchen had a specific character. The salt and smoke of the curing foods mingle with the fresh fire and the cooking of the day's fresh food, the spices in the locked chest adding their occasional high notes of pepper and ginger when the cook opened it for seasoning. It was a dense, complex, entirely distinctive smell that, encountered suddenly and out of context, would immediately transport a medieval servant back to their kitchen, the way smells transport memory with a specificity that no other sense can manage. The noise in the kitchen by mid-morning was considerable. Chopping on the great wooden table, the hiss and spit of things cooking, the clank of iron pots, instructions given and repeated, the occasional sharp words of the cook when something was going wrong. In a busy kitchen preparing for a large dinner, the controlled chaos of the space required real experience to navigate without injury or error. You moved through it carefully. Everyone did. One of the most persistent myths about medieval servants is that they subsisted on the dregs and leavings of the Lord's table, scraps of meat and crusts of bread that trickled down from above like the world's least appealing economic system. The reality was more nuanced and, in some ways, rather more interesting. Medieval household accounts, the financial records kept by the steward or treasurer that recorded expenditures on food, drink, wages, and supplies, show that upper servants in a large household ate quite substantially. This was not charity or sentiment. It was practical economics. A servant who was too hungry to work effectively was an immediate liability. The medieval household understood perfectly well that food was a form of working capital. The servant's diet was differentiated from the Lord's table primarily in quality and variety, rather than in quantity. Where the Lord's dinner might feature imported spices, expensive fish, delicate pastries, and wine from specific regions, the servant's version of the same meal, served separately, at their own table in the hall or in a dedicated servant space, would feature the same basic ingredients in plainer preparation. More pottage, the thick vegetable and grain stew that was a workhorse dish of the medieval period in all social classes. More bread, and bread of slightly coarser grain. More ale, since ale rather than wine was a standard drink of the working household. It was safer than water, which was often contaminated, and the low alcohol content of everyday medieval ale was sufficient to inhibit bacterial growth without meaningfully impairing a person's ability to haul a bucket of water up a staircase, which is the main thing the household needed from the ale. Breakfast for servants was a quiet affair, not a formal meal. Medieval formal meals were complex social rituals that required setup and attention and elaborate protocols of service. The servant's morning food was practical, a piece of bread, often from the previous day's baking, and ale. In some households, a morning pottage, a thin, watery version of the midday version, more porridge and stew, was available. It was warm. On a cold January morning, after 2 hours of fire laying and water carrying, it was warmly welcomed. Bread is worth talking about, because bread in the medieval period was not a single thing. It was a whole spectrum of things, and your position in the social order was precisely indicated by where on that spectrum your bread fell. The finest white bread, called wastel or manchet in later periods, was made from the most finely sifted flour, with the bran removed, and it was reserved for the Lord's table and high-status guests. Further down the hierarchy came bread of progressively less refined flour, through whole wheat, through rye, through mixtures of grains and legumes, all the way to maslin bread, a mixture of rye and wheat, and eventually the dark, dense loaves that a modern artisan baker would call rustic and a 14th century lord would call servant bread. It was hearty. It was filling. It was nutritionally quite sound, since the whole grain breads retained vitamins and fiber that the fine white bread discarded with the bran. The servants were, from a nutritional standpoint, often eating better bread than the lord, which is one of history's smaller but more satisfying ironies. The ale was brewed in the castle's own brewery, or ale house, typically by a dedicated brewer who managed the production of enough ale to supply the entire household. In a large house, this was a continuous operation. Ale had a short shelf life before it soured or went bad, so production was ongoing and the quantities consumed were substantial. Estimates based on household accounts suggest that servants might receive between 1 and 3 gallons of ale per day as part of their board, though gallons here refers to medieval measures that don't quite map to modern ones, and the ale itself was considerably weaker than modern beer. Nevertheless, the scale of ale production in a large castle was impressive. The brewery was a serious operation. You drink your morning ale in the hall, sitting on a bench at the lower table. The bread is dense but warm. The fire has been burning properly for an hour now, and the hall has begun to shed some of its night cold. Outside, the castle is fully awake. You can hear the sound of the courtyard, hooves on stone, voices giving instructions, the bark of one of the lord's hunting dogs. The day is underway. The lower table is its own social world. The people around you are the people you know better than almost anyone. You have slept in the same room with most of them, worked alongside all of them, navigated the complex small diplomacy of communal life together for months or years. The morning conversation is quiet and practical. What needs doing today? Who has heard what? The small informational currency of community that is always, in some sense, talking to itself. Someone has heard that guests are expected before noon, which means the kitchen will be busier than usual, and the hall will need to be presentable earlier than the normal schedule allows. This information moves around the table not as formal announcement, but as the natural current of shared awareness that maintains a functioning household. You absorb it. You adjust your mental ordering of the morning's tasks accordingly. The ale is good this week. The brewer got the proportions right in the last batch, which makes the pale liquid in your wooden cup something more than just a safe alternative to the well water. You appreciate in the straightforward, unself-conscious way of someone who knows they have another 10 hours of work ahead, and that these are the pleasant minutes before it recommences. And now you must go to work. Really go to work. Because breakfast was the brief pause between getting up and the actual work of the day, and the work of the day does not wait. Before we follow the work of the day, we need to understand something fundamental about medieval castle service that shapes every interaction, every task, every moment of every day. The hierarchy. Medieval castle service was not a flat organization where everyone did whatever needed doing. It was a deeply structured system with defined ranks, defined responsibilities, defined privileges, and defined consequences for getting any of it wrong. In this sense, it resembled a modern corporation, except that the performance review could result in immediate homelessness rather than just a tense conversation with HR. At the very top of the household service structure stood the steward, sometimes called the seneschal. This person was typically not a servant in any conventional sense. They were often a minor noble or gentleman in their own right, appointed to manage the lord's household and estates with full administrative authority. The steward oversaw the finances, managed the staff, presided over the household court where minor disputes were settled, and was essentially the CEO of the castle enterprise. The steward had his own rooms, his own servants, and enough social standing to make it awkward when people didn't show him appropriate respect. Below the steward came the chamberlain, who managed the lord's private chambers, his personal possessions, his wardrobe, and the most intimate aspects of his daily life. The chamberlain had access to the lord's most private moments, dressing, bathing, retiring to bed, and this access made the position both prestigious and a little delicate. The chamberlain needed to be not only competent, but discreet. What was seen and heard in the Lord's private chambers stayed in the private chambers. This was a professional expectation with teeth. The butler managed the wine cellar in the buttery, the room where the ale, wine, and drinking vessels were stored, and oversaw the formal service of drinks during meals. In a large household, the butler had a staff of his own, including cupbearers whose specific function was to present the Lord with his drink in the correct vessel with the correct ceremony. Serving wine to a medieval lord was a procedure with its own protocol. The cup was supposed to be tasted first by the serving person as a demonstration that it had not been poisoned, which sounds dramatic until you remember that poisoning was an actual method of political elimination in the medieval period. And great lords took it seriously. The cupbearer's job thus required both good health and a willingness to be, in a technical sense, the first person to test the wine. This was not technically a benefit package that most candidates for position advertised on their terms of employment, but it came with the role. The marshal managed the stables and everything related to the horses, the grooms, the farriers, the equipment. The horses of a noble household were not pets or incidentals. They were fundamental infrastructure. A lord without horses was a lord without military capability, without transport, without hunting, without the ability to project any of the physical authority that medieval noble life was built upon. The horses were expensive, valuable, and carefully managed. The marshal was accordingly a person of real significance. The chaplain managed the spiritual life of the household. The chapel, the daily services, the religious calendar that shaped the structure of the year. He was not exactly a servant, but not exactly independent either. He served the household's religious needs in exchange for accommodation, food, and a stipend. And then below all of these came the graduated layers of grooms, pages, ladies' maids, chamberwomen, kitchen workers, laundresses, gardeners, stable boys, watchmen, gatekeepers, and the dozens of other specific roles that kept the physical reality of the castle functioning from hour to hour. As a servant, you knew your exact position in this structure. You knew who you could give orders to. You knew who you could not. You knew who you needed to address with formal courtesy, and who you could speak to with something closer to directness. This knowledge was not written down in a manual you had been given at employment. It was absorbed through daily experience, through watching others, through the occasional sharp correction when you got something wrong. The hierarchy was, in this sense, a living thing, present in every interaction, shaping every conversation, as ambient and inescapable as the stone walls themselves. Your particular position within this hierarchy determined where you ate, where you slept, how much you earned, and what your daily work consisted of. It also determined, in subtle and not so subtle ways, how you thought of yourself. Perhaps the most striking difference between a medieval castle and any modern workplace is the presence of children. Children in the medieval period entered formal service very early. A boy might be placed as a page in a noble household at 7 or 8 years old, sometimes younger, in the case of elite families who sent their sons to serve in a household of greater lords as a form of social education and networking that had no modern equivalent except perhaps a very intense internship with significantly more cleaning involved. These were not servant children in the sense of children of servants. They were often the sons of minor gentry and local noble families, placed deliberately in a great household to learn the manners, skills, and social connections that would serve them in adult life. The page's existence was a curious blend of education and service. He learned to ride horses, to handle weapons, to move correctly through a great hall, to serve at table with the proper gestures and words. He learned to read in some households. He learned music in others. He absorbed the social codes of aristocratic life through total immersion, in the way that only children raised inside a culture can absorb its deepest grammar. And he did this while also carrying messages, assisting senior servants, fetching items, and performing the low-status tasks that were simply part of the daily machinery of a busy household. The page's position was simultaneously apprenticeship and service, future aspiration and present reality for the children of actual servants, the sons and daughters of grooms, laundresses, kitchen workers. The entry into work happened at similarly young ages, but without the genteel educational framing. A child of 7 or 8 in a working household was expected to contribute usefully, carrying small loads, running errands within the castle, helping in the kitchen with simple preparatory tasks, gathering herbs from the garden, minding the turnspit. The turnspit position, turning the roasting spit in the kitchen over the fire, was frequently assigned to children because it required sustained attention more than physical strength, and children were available. This does not mean children did it cheerfully. The medieval kitchen records are silent on the subject of turnspit opinions, but the evidence of the heat generated by a large open fire, combined with the nature of the task, suggests the experience was educational in a rather specific kind of way. Girls in the household, daughters of servants or younger daughters of gentlefolk placed in service, might be trained as ladies' maids or chamber women. They learned to sew and mend with precision. They learned to dress a lady's hair, a skill that required practice and produced, in its practitioners, a specific fine motor dexterity that showed in everything they did with their hands afterward. They learned to read a room, to understand the emotional climate of the households they moved through, to be simultaneously present and unobtrusive. These were not trivial skills. They were genuinely sophisticated social and practical competencies, and the women who developed them well could advance to the household hierarchy or find excellent positions in other households, carrying their reputation with them as their primary professional credential. The relationship between the youngest servants and the senior household members was not always straightforwardly exploitative, though it could be. Conduct manuals from a period suggest that senior servants had genuine obligations of instruction toward their juniors, and some household accounts record small gifts and rewards given to pages or young servants who performed especially well: a new pair of shoes, a small coin, an extra portion at feast. The system could produce something that looked, at its best, like a genuine community of training and advancement. At its worst, of course, it produced children working long hours in difficult conditions with little recourse and no legal protection worthy of the name. The castle, through these young faces at its tables and in its corridors, was always also a school. What it taught depended on where you sat in it, and how old you were when you sat down. If you were a body servant, a gentleman of the chamber, or a groom of the chamber in a large royal household, or simply the senior personal attendant in a smaller castle, then the most important part of your morning was the Lord's morning. And the Lord's morning was an event. You had been up since before 4. You had seen to the fires. You had organized the water. And now, at a time somewhere between 6 and 7, you stood outside the door to the solar, the Lord's private apartments, waiting for the signal that he had stirred. What happened next was a formalized procedure that tells us an enormous amount about medieval ideas of status, privacy, and the relationship between powerful people and the humans who served them. The Lord woke to the presence of servants. This was not considered invasive. It was considered correct. Privacy, as a modern person understands it, the expectation of time alone, of closed doors, of a life that belongs entirely to oneself, was not a widely held value in the medieval period. Privacy was a luxury of rank, and even for the very highest ranks, it was partial and situational. A great lord waking alone, dressing alone, beginning his day without witnesses or assistants, would have seemed peculiar to his contemporaries. Not dignified, not self-sufficient, but simply unusual. The presence of attendants during waking and dressing was a mark of status, not an intrusion upon it. You entered when called. The chamber was warmer than the hall, because it had a fireplace and was smaller, and you had already been in earlier to lay that fire. The Lord's bed was a substantial piece of furniture in a great household, a proper bed with curtains that could be drawn closed to create a small, warm, enclosed space, the curtains providing both warmth retention and a version of privacy that worked partly by making others pretend not to be able to see through fabric. The mattress was filled with wool, or down rather than straw. The sheets were linen. The blankets were wool, sometimes with fur lining. This was the most comfortable sleeping arrangement in the castle by a considerable margin, and it shows in the historical evidence. Great lords who traveled had their beds transported with them, because sleeping in a strange place in a strange bed was genuinely uncomfortable, and the quality of your own familiar bedding was worth the logistics. You brought the warm washing water. You brought the towels, linen, because linen washes and dries more efficiently than wool, and is less scratchy against a recently washed face. You brought the Lord's clothing in the order in which it was to be put on, because the Lord's dressing was a layered process not entirely unlike a modern business person laying out clothes the night before, except that someone else was laying out the clothes and also helping put them on, and there were considerably more layers involved. Assisting with dressing for a medieval lord of any significance was a skilled task. The lacing and tying of a complex medieval outfit, the fine linen shirt, the fitted doublet, the hose, the shoes, the belt, the various accessories of rank and occasion, required both physical dexterity and memory, because the correct clothing for a given day was not always the same. A feast day required different garments than a hunting day. Receiving important guests required yet another configuration. You were expected to know what the day held, and to have prepared the appropriate clothing without being explicitly told, because being told what you should already know was a form of criticism in the medieval service relationship. You helped the lord dress. You probably did not speak unless spoken of first, except for specific functional communications. My lord, the water is ready, because knowing when to be audible and when to be functionally invisible was one of the most important skills a personal servant possessed. The ability to be present but unobtrusive, to attend without intruding, to do the thing without drawing attention to the doing of it. This was considered a genuine professional virtue. Some medieval conduct manuals for servants, and they existed. The Babe's Book, written in the mid-15th century, gave detailed instructions for correct behavior for young men in service, emphasized exactly this capacity to manage one's presence. Once the lord was dressed, prayers came. The household chaplain was likely involved, and a brief morning prayer in a chapel or the Lord's private oratory, a small prayer space adjacent to the solar, in many castle designs, began the formal part of the day. Religion was not optional in a medieval household. It was structural. The canonical hours shaped the day's rhythm the way a modern calendar shapes a workday, and attendance at morning prayers was expected from everyone who was in any position to attend, which meant anyone who was not occupied with tasks that couldn't be paused. And you, having helped the Lord through his waking, his washing, his dressing, and his morning prayers, were now free to continue the other 12 things that needed doing before noon. Every morning, the great hall needed to be transformed from the sleeping quarters that had been the previous night into the dignified social and administrative space it was supposed to be for the rest of the day. This was not a small undertaking. The rushes on the floor were the first challenge. Floor coverings in the great hall and other frequently used rooms were typically layers of dried rushes, grasses, and aromatic herbs like meadowsweet, lavender, and mint, spread over the stone floor to provide some insulation, to cushion foot traffic, and to deal, with varying success, with the inevitable biological consequences of having large numbers of people and animals in the same space. The herbs masked smells. The rushes absorbed liquid. The whole layered mass grew richer, deeper, and more complex with time. How often the rushes were replaced varied by household and by the time of year. In a well-managed great household, the top layer might be refreshed frequently, while the lower layers were left longer. In a less meticulous establishment, historical sources suggest the rushes might accumulate for months at a time, becoming what one medieval commentary described, with remarkable understatement, as something that harbored filth and ordure and other things not to be named. This was not an exaggeration. The lower layers of old rush matting in a busy hall could contain food scraps, dog deposits, spilled ale, and remains of small animals that had wandered in and not wandered out again. Erasmus, writing in the early 16th century about English household hygiene, expressed concern about the management of floor rushes in terms that suggest his concern had its basis in direct experience. Erasmus was not a man who romanticized his observations. Each morning, servants raked the top of the rushes to gather the obvious debris, bones, bread scraps, anything visible, and swept the edges where accumulation was worst. Periodically, the whole mass came out and fresh rushes went in, an operation that required the full hall to be essentially cleared and involved a degree of olfactory revelation that even the servants, with their robust daily experience of the hall, found memorable. The fresh rushes, spread thickly and scattered with herbs, transformed the space for a while. The transformation was temporary, but the medieval relationship with temporariness was more accepting than the modern one. The high table at the upper end of the hall, where the lord and lady and their senior guests ate, needed to be wiped down and prepared. The trestle tables at which the wider household and lower servants dined were typically disassembled and stored along the walls after meals and set up again for the next meal, which created a twice-daily cycle of assembly and disassembly that kept a small group of servants occupied. The benches were wiped. The tablecloths, linen, of varying quality depending on where in the hall they were being used. Finest near the high table and progressively plainer toward the lower end were checked, shaken out, or replaced if they were too stained from the previous evening to be presentable. The hearth was swept of its accumulated ash. A fresh fire was laid for the day. The wall hangings, tapestries, or woven fabric panels that served the dual purpose of decoration and insulation, covering the cold stone walls and significantly reducing the wind-chill effect in the stone building, were straightened and checked for damage. Dogs were managed. The Lord's hunting dogs were valuable animals, carefully bred and highly regarded, and they spent considerable time in and around the hall. They also behaved as dogs behave in any age, opportunistically. Food left unguarded disappeared. The floor was a legitimate alternative to outside for a dog who hadn't yet had his morning walk. The servants who managed the Lord's dogs, called dog boys or kennel servants, were responsible for the animals' care, feeding, exercise, and the consequences of their presence indoors. This was a full-time occupation that required genuine animal knowledge and the ability to move a large, potentially uncooperative dog from a location where it was not supposed to be to a location where it was, with firmness and without drama. By the time all of this was done, and it took the better part of 2 hours with a competent crew, the hall was ready to receive the day's traffic. It smelled of fresh rushes and wood smoke. The fire burned clearly. The tables were set. The hanging caught the morning light and made the stone room look, if not exactly warm, then at least lived in and civilized. While all of this was happening inside the main castle buildings, an entirely separate and equally demanding world of work was underway in the stables. A noble household of any real standing had horses, and horses are, from a daily management standpoint, a significant commitment. They need to be fed twice a day, at minimum. They need clean water constantly. Their stalls need to be mucked out every morning. Horses produce between 40 and 50 pounds of manure daily, a number that the modern mind finds somewhat arresting, but that the groom accepted as simply the defining fact of his professional existence. They need to be groomed. They need their hooves checked. Their tack needs to be cleaned and maintained and stored properly. And all of this happens 7 days a week, without exception, because a horse does not observe feast days. The marshal or his chief grooms began the morning stable work before dawn, before the hall was swept, before the Lord was dressed, before breakfast was served. The horses needed feeding first. Their primary food was hay, stored in the loft above the stable, supplemented with grain, oats principally, for the working horses and especially for the war horses, who required the extra caloric energy of a high-grain diet in much the same way a modern high-performance athlete requires a carefully calibrated diet. The quality and quantity of grain fed to different horses was tracked in household accounts because the horses, in an economic sense, were among the most valuable assets the household possessed. A trained war horse, a destrier, was worth a small fortune. Prices recorded in medieval English sources suggest that the most valuable war horses might cost more than 20 pounds, at a time when a skilled craftsman might earn 3 or 4 pounds a year. These animals were not mismanaged. They were given the best care the grooms knew how to provide, which was actually quite sophisticated by the standards of practical knowledge. Medieval groom manuals, texts like the Mariscalci of Rusius, written in the 14th century, cover horse care, lameness, feeding, and disease with the thoroughness of people who understood that the animal's health was a direct economic and military matter. The smell of the stable was its own complete experience. Horses produce a warm, dense hay and ammonia smell that is either completely offensive or oddly comforting, depending entirely on whether you grew up around horses. Stable grooms, who spent most of their waking hours in that smell, had made their peace with it to such a degree that they often failed to notice when they carried it with them into other parts of the castle, which the kitchen staff and chamber servants found notable and not always in a complimentary way. The grooms who mucked out the stalls used wide wooden shovels and wheelbarrows. The wheelbarrow is a medieval innovation, not a modern one, appearing in English manuscripts from the 13th century onward, and deposited the manure in the midden, the castle's general waste heap, located in the corner of the outer ward as far from the main residential buildings as the geometry of the castle allowed. The midden was also where kitchen waste, ash from the fires, and various other organic refuse ended up, and it was managed with more care than its name might suggest. Midden contents were valuable as agricultural fertilizer, and there is evidence in the state records of manure being transported from castle middens to fields as a deliberate agricultural input. The medieval economy wasted very little. By mid-morning, the stalls were clean and rebedded with fresh straw. The horses had been fed and watered. Those being used today, for hunting, for travel, for carrying the lord or his guests, were being groomed. The coat curried with a stiff brush, the mane and tail combed, the hooves cleaned with pick to remove packed mud and stone. A well-groomed horse presented well, and presentation mattered. A lord arriving somewhere on a filthy, unkempt horse made a statement about his household management that was not the statement he wanted to make. The grooms worked quietly and quickly around the animals, with a specific economy of movement that comes from long practice in the company of large animals that can injure you if startled. They spoke softly to the horses as they worked. This was not sentiment, or not only sentiment. Horses are responsive to vocal calm, and a softly spoken groom was a safer and more effective groom than a loud one. The practical wisdom of stable work accumulated the way all practical wisdom does, through experience, observation, and the occasional sharp lesson from a large animal that had run out of patience. In the medieval castle, the main meal of the day happened at midday, called dinner, not in the evening, as modern practice has it, but in the middle of the day when natural light was at its best and the household had finished the primary business of the morning. The evening meal, called supper, was lighter and quieter, but dinner, the midday meal in a great household, was a performance, not metaphorically, literally. The service of formal medieval dinner in a great hall operated according to conventions and choreography that were as precisely organized as any theatrical production, with a strict cast of characters, defined staging, and an audience, the assembled household, who understood exactly when things were going correctly and when something had gone wrong. You understand this because you have spent months learning it. If you are a servant at the high table level, one of those responsible for serving the Lord in his immediate circle, you've been trained, watched, and corrected until the sequence of service is as automatic as your own heartbeat. The meal began with ceremony. Before anything was served, the table had to be formally set. The tablecloth was spread, and in a great household this was itself a ritual. The cloth was carried to the table, unfolded, and laid with specific attention to its placement relative to the salt cellar. The salt cellar, the salt, as it was called, was a defining object in the medieval dining room. In a wealthy household, it was a beautiful piece of silverware or gilded metalwork, and its position on the table defined everything. High-status guests sat above the salt, closer to the Lord. Lesser guests and servants ate below the salt. Everyone knew which side they were on. To be moved from below to above was a social promotion visible to the entire room. To be seated below when you expected above was a public humiliation conducted in full view of the assembled household. The salt cellar was doing a great deal of work for a container of sodium chloride. Trenchers were set out. In the 14th century, trenchers, the thick slices of stale bread that served as edible plates, were still in common use, though wooden and later pewter plates were also becoming more common. The trencher absorbed the sauces and gravies from the food placed on it, and at the end of the meal, it was either eaten. A meal's worth of sauce-soaked bread was not unappealing if you were hungry, or given to the poor who waited at the castle gates, or to the dogs. Nothing was wasted. Then the food came. From the kitchen to hall was a journey that, in a large castle, might cover some distance, through corridors, across courtyards, sometimes upstairs. Food service in this context required speed to keep things warm, and teams of servers who move in coordinated sequence. The chief cook or his representative would lead the procession of dishes with a certain ceremony, particularly for important occasions, walking ahead of the food bearers in a way that made the arrival of dinner into something between a parade and an announcement. At the high table, the carver, a skilled servant whose specific function was the ceremonially correct cutting and presentation of meat, performed his role with practiced authority. Carving in the medieval period was a genuine skill with its own specialized vocabulary and its own manual literature. Different animals were carved differently. The correct term for cutting a pheasant was different from the correct term for cutting a rabbit or a venison haunch, and knowing the right word was part of performing the role correctly. Using the wrong term was not merely an error. It was a social marker that communicated something about where you had learned your skills, and whether that summer was sufficiently prestigious. The Lord and his immediate companions were served first and attended throughout the meal. Fresh courses were brought. Dishes were removed. Wine and ale were poured. Bread was presented with the correct gesture and placement. Every element of this had a correct way and an incorrect way, and a well-trained household servant knew the difference. Meanwhile, at the lower tables, the rest of the household was eating a somewhat less elaborately managed version of the same meal. The food quality was stepped down appropriately. The service was less formal, and the atmosphere was more relaxed. But even here there were customs and protocols. Certain people sat in certain places. Certain behaviors were expected. The hall was a shared social space, and the meal was a moment when the entire household, from the lord at the high table to the groom at the end of the lower bench, was present in the same room, eating together, which was a statement about community and belonging that medieval people understood and valued. You served, cleared, poured, and moved quietly around the edges of the scene, part of performance without being performance, present without being noticed. This was your skill, and you were good at it. After dinner, you did not rest. The afternoon was a full shift in its own right, and it brought its own category of tasks. Laundry was perhaps the defining labor of medieval household servants, not because it was the most skilled or the most complex, but because it was the most continuous, the most physically demanding, and the most unrelenting. In a large castle household, the laundry was constant. Bed linen, table linen, personal linen. The shirts and chemises and towels, and all the washable fabric that the household used, needed regular washing, and washing in the medieval period was an undertaking that bore no resemblance to the act of pressing a button on a machine and then going to make yourself a cup of tea. Laundry required water, fire, time, and considerable physical strength. Water was heated in large cauldrons over the fire, the first step in a process that required a substantial quantity of hot water per wash. The fabrics were beaten, agitated, and rubbed against wooden washing boards or flat stones to work out the soil. For more stubborn staining, the linen might be soaked in a lye solution, water mixed with ash that produced a highly alkaline liquid with genuine cleaning power. This was effective but hard on the hands. Regular exposure to lye solution produced skin that was rough, cracked, and occasionally chemically burned if the mixture was too strong. Laundresses' hands, described in medieval sources and confirmed by the skeletal evidence of people whose occupation can be linked to laundry work, tell a clear physical story of a difficult trade. After washing, the linen had to be rinsed, which required clean water, which required another trip to well, and then wrung out and dried. Drying in the medieval period happened on lines, on bushes and hedges, on the clean grass of a meadow if one was available, or on racks inside the kitchen if the weather didn't cooperate. In English weather, which has never been reliably cooperative, the indoor drying option was used frequently, which meant that damp linen occupied warming space near the kitchen fire and gave the already complex kitchen atmosphere an additional note of damp wool and lye. The laundress was typically a specific position in the household, filled by a woman of some experience and recognized skill. The washing of fine linen, particularly the Lord's personal linen, required knowledge of how much agitation different fabrics could tolerate without damage, how to treat specific stains, and how to preserve the whiteness of fine linen. Bleaching in sunlight was a primary technique, and a laundress who kept her linens white was doing demonstrably good work in the most visible possible medium. While laundry occupied one section of the afternoon staff, other servants were engaged in cleaning, mending, and maintaining the physical fabric of the castle. Floors swept again, ashes removed from fireplaces, candle stubs collected and taken back to the chandler for rendering into new tallow candles, because candle stubs were not garbage. They were raw material. Everything recyclable was recycled, because everything recyclable had a value. Mending occupied the women of the household in a continuous background activity. Fabric was expensive. Clothing lasted until it could not be repaired further, and then it lasted a little longer. Needle and thread were constant companion for any woman in a medieval household, and the ability to mend neatly, to replace a worn cuff, to patch a tear invisibly, to reinforce a seam that was starting to fail, was a basic domestic competency rather than a specialized craft. The Lord's clothing was attended by his personal servants, who kept his wardrobe in a state of constant repair. The servants' own clothing was mended when they could find time, which was a category of time that appeared less frequently than might be desirable. The afternoon also brought the various small repairs that kept the castle physically functional. Tallow for candles needed to be melted and poured. Rushes were gathered from a nearby stream or meadow and brought in to supplement the hall supply. Tools and equipment were cleaned, sharpened, or returned to their proper storage. The list of afternoon tasks and surviving household accounts from the medieval period have a slightly dizzying quality. The sheer quantity of small, specific things that needed doing in a large household every day to keep it in working order is impressive even at the removal of 7 centuries. The castle garden was not primarily decorative. This is another place where the popular image, a peaceful ornamental garden where ladies sat in pleasant weather, needs some adjustment. Yes, ornamental gardens existed, and they were a genuine feature of aristocratic life from at least the 12th century onward. Pleasure gardens with flower beds, train vines, perhaps a fountain or fish pond, hedgerows trimmed into neat shapes. These were real, and we have both archaeological evidence and manuscript illustrations to confirm their existence and their appeal. But alongside the pleasure garden, and considerably more central to the castle's daily operations, was the working garden. The kitchen garden and the physic garden, planted with the herbs, vegetables, and medicinal plants that the household needed for food preparation, flavoring, preservation, and medical treatment. The kitchen garden was the domain of the gardeners, typically men, in the medieval period, though women managed kitchen gardens at the level of the peasant household. In a castle, the gardener was a professional whose knowledge of cultivation was genuine and extensive. He knew which herbs went in sun and which in shade. He knew how to grow leeks and onions and garlic and turnips and parsnips and cabbages, the workhorses of medieval vegetable cookery. He knew how to save seeds from one season to the next. He knew the rhythm of planting and harvest for a particular location and its particular soil, accumulated over years of direct observation. Medieval English cooking relied heavily on the kitchen garden. Onions and leeks were fundamental flavoring agents in pottage and sauces. Garlic was used for flavoring and believed to have health protective properties. Herbs, not just for flavoring but for preservation, were essential to the kitchen's operation. Rosemary and sage were used in the cooking of meat. Parsley was ubiquitous. Mint went into sauces and drinks. Dill and fennel were used with fish. The physic garden, the medicinal garden, grew plants prescribed by the household's medical reference, which in this period was typically a mixture of learned medical tradition derived from ancient Greek and Arabic sources, transmitted into Western Europe through Latin translations, and practical local herbalism that had accumulated through generations of practical use. Comfort for poultices, lavender for its calming properties, chamomile as a digestive, feverfew for headaches. The castle's medical garden was its primary pharmacy, and the care of it was taken seriously. The gardeners worked seasonally in a way that differed from indoor servants. Their busiest times were planting and harvest, with the summer growing season requiring intensive attention to watering, weeding, and managing the ever-present pressure of insects and birds on the crop. In winter, the garden went quiet, a dormancy that indoor servants, who had no equivalent slow season, might have regarded with something between envy and bafflement. The gardener generally occupied a position in the household hierarchy below the indoor servants of equivalent skill, but above the general outdoor laborers. He had specialized knowledge. He was not easily replaced with anyone who happened to be available. This gave him a quiet professional security that not everyone in the castle enjoyed. One thing that separates the medieval servant's experience of time from a modern person's is that the seasons were not background information. They were not whether you glanced at while waiting for your commute. They were the organizing principle of the year, as fundamental as breath, shaping everything from the work you did to the food you ate to how many daylight hours you had to do it in. The medieval year moved through phases as distinct as the chapters of a long story, and the castle felt each one. January and February were the hard months. The work of keeping the castle warm, the firewood, the banking of fires, the hauling of water that froze at the edges of buckets in a hard frost, was relentless. Food, while stocked from the autumn harvest, needed careful management. The salted and smoked and dried provisions that constituted the castle's winter stores were being drawn down, and the household officers watching the accounts knew that there were still months to go before fresh meat and vegetables would be available again. Livestock had been slaughtered in November in what was called the Martimas Killing, named for the feast of St. Martin on the 11th of November, because there was not enough hay to overwinter every animal on the estate. The salted and smoked carcasses of those animals lined the storerooms, becoming the foundation of winter cooking. The cold settled into the servants' bones with familiarity that stopped being remarkable after a few years in service. You dressed in your layers. You worked near the fire when you could. You moved quickly when you had to cross the courtyard in the wind, because speed was its own kind of warmth. March announced itself with mud. The courtyard, the paths between buildings, the track to the well, all became particular medieval mud that was less like a weather condition and more like a decision the ground had made. Horses moved through it with resigned competence. Servants moved through it with slightly less resigned competence and considerably worse shoes. But with March came lengthening days, and the lengthening days were a genuine annual renewal. Each evening that the light held a few minutes longer than the one before was a small, tangible improvement in the quality of existence, noticed and appreciated. Planting began in the kitchen garden. The gardeners emerged from winter with their plans and their seed stores and began the patient work of preparation. Digging, manuring. The castle's winter manure output now being put to its intended agricultural use, and planting the first cold-tolerant crops. Peas and beans went in early. The legumes that both fed the household, and through a mechanism of nitrogen fixation that medieval farmers observed without quite understanding, improved the soil for what followed. April and May were the castle's best months in the way that spring is everyone's best months, amplified by a winter of genuine difficulty. The countryside around the walls went green with a speed that seemed, after 4 months of bare branches and gray sky, almost aggressive. The days grew long enough to work in full light from 5 in the morning to 8 in the evening. Fresh food began to appear. Early vegetables in the garden, the first spring greens, fresh fish in the rivers and ponds, young lamb. The change in diet from the preserved monotony of winter to the fresh variety of late spring was experienced as a genuine physical pleasure. Summer brought its own demands. The castle's agricultural lands, and a castle of any significance sat at the center of the estate that included farmland worked by tenants, required intensive labor through the summer, particularly at harvest. Some castle servants might be temporarily reassigned to help with the harvest on the domain, the land farmed directly for the Lord's benefit, during the most labor-intensive periods. Haymaking in July and grain harvest in August and September were all-hands moments, when the urgency of getting the crop in before the weather turned overrode the usual boundaries between indoor and outdoor work. The kitchen garden in summer was at its peak, and the castle's cooks had access to fresh produce in abundance. Herbs were gathered and dried for winter. Fruit, whatever the estate's orchards produced, was preserved, dried, made into conserves with honey, turned into cider or perry. The castle's economy of preservation was a continuous summer project, because the winter would come again, and the winter did not negotiate. Autumn brought the harvest completion, and the beginning of winter preparation in earnest. Animals were evaluated, which to keep, which to slaughter. Firewood stocks were assessed, and if necessary supplemented from the Lord's woodland. The castle's accounts of the year were reviewed, and the steward planned the coming year's expenditures against the income from a harvest just completed. And then the wheel turned again. The days shortened. The leaves fell. The mud returned to the courtyard. The fire in the great hall became once more the center of gravity around which the indoor life of the castle organized itself, and the servants who slept beside it pulled their blankets a little closer and watched the embers with a particular appreciation of people who know, from long experience, exactly how cold the floor is going to be in the morning. The year was not a line from January to December. It was a circle, and you moved around it with everyone else, and you knew every point on it the way you knew every step on the kitchen stair. If you are a servant in a medieval castle household, one of the most significant factors of your social life is this. Your freedom to choose your own marriage partner is constrained in ways that a modern person would find startling. This is not because medieval people were uninterested in romantic choice or personal feeling. It is because marriage in the medieval period was understood primarily as an economic and social contract, not as a personal romantic fulfillment. And for a servant, that contract had an additional layer of complexity. Your employer had a legitimate interest in it. In the medieval legal framework, particularly in the context of manorial and serfdom law, which applied to many of the lower servants on a noble estate. A serf could not marry without the lord's permission. This was a formal legal requirement backed by real consequences. The payment for this permission was called merchet, a fee that varied in size depending on the household and the individuals involved, but that existed as a genuine transaction. The lord's interest in the serf's marriage was not entirely sentimental or controlling for its own sake. It was partly economic, because a serf who married outside the manor represented a potential loss of labor and productive capacity to the state, and the merchet was compensation for this possible inconvenience. For servants who were freemen, and by the 14th century, particularly after the disruptions of the Black Death, the legal distinctions between serf and free servant had become considerably more complicated. The situation was different but not entirely unconstrained. A servant who wished to marry and leave service was essentially resigning, and the household's economic interest in its trained staff meant that such departures were not always welcomed. High-quality servants with specific skills, a trained cook, an experienced chamberlain, a lady's maid who knew the household's operations thoroughly, were assets that a household preferred to retain. For women servants in particular, marriage typically meant the end of formal castle service. The domestic labor of managing a household of your own, whatever size a household might be, was not structurally compatible with full-time residential service in someone else's household, and the expectation that a married woman's primary organizational loyalty was to her own family was widely shared. Some women continued in service after marriage, particularly as ladies' maids of their mistress was closely attached to them, but this was the exception rather than the rule. This meant that marriage represented, for female servants, a significant life transition that required careful consideration. A good match to a skilled craftsman, a prosperous farmer, a man with a steady trade, could offer a notably better material life than continued service. A poor match could offer considerably less. The calculation was real and consequential, and the social networks of the castle, the connections between households, the gossip of market days, the visibility of who was eligible and who was not, were important information systems that servants navigated with intelligence. Romance within the castle existed. Inevitably, young people in close proximity develop attachments with or without the endorsement of their employers, and medieval sources, court records, church registers, conduct manuals, suggest that romantic and sexual relationships within castle household were common, sometimes tolerated, sometimes problematic, and occasionally resulting in legal complications or pregnancy that required formal resolution. The conduct manuals for servants, notably, spent considerable energy advising young male servants to be respectful and discreet in their dealings with women of the household, which strongly implies that disrespect and indiscretion were not theoretical concerns. The castle was a small world. Everyone knew everyone's business. This created both the warmth of genuine community and particular social pressure of a life lived in permanent proximity to the same 24 or 50 people day after day for years. The social intelligence required to navigate that, to know when to be friendly, when to be discreet, when to be invisible, when a thing was happening that you had not seen and would not remember, was a genuine and important skill. The castle was not, despite the impression it might give from the inside, a sealed system. It was embedded in the wider economy of its region, dependent on the trade networks of nearby towns and the goods produced by neighboring estates and the distant commerce that moved along the roads of medieval England. And several times a month, the castle sent its representatives out into that wider world. Market day was a regular feature of medieval economic life, in a way that has no precise modern equivalent. Towns were granted market charters by the crown, the legal right to hold a weekly or twice-weekly market, and these charter markets were the primary point of retail exchange for goods across a wide rural area. A castle's household shopped at market, not for everything. Much of what the castle needed was produced within its own walls or on its own estate, but for the specialized goods, the imported materials, the particular items that the castle's economy couldn't generate internally, the servant or servants designated to go to market, typically under the supervision of the steward or the butler, depending on what was being purchased, left the castle in the early morning to make the walk or ride to town. The market itself was a place of considerable sensory density. The sound of animals being sold in the livestock section of the market, the calls of vendors, the smell of fresh bread from the baker's stall, the metallic tang of newly worked iron from the smith's area, the complex overlapping odors of fish and spice, and tanned leather and fresh vegetables and human crowd. For a servant whose daily world was bounded by the castle's walls, the market was an encounter with scale and variety. There were people here from many miles around, peasants selling their surplus produce, craftsmen displaying their wares, traveling merchants with goods from farther afield. There was news here, carried along the roads and trading networks, word of events in distant towns, of the state of the harvest in other regions, of the movements of important people. The market was the medieval equivalent of news media, and was considerably more interactive and considerably louder. The purchasing of food for the castle household was a skilled task. The steward's man or the butler's deputy needed to assess quality. Was this fish fresh or merely fresh enough? Was this grain dry and well kept or showing the early signs of spoilage? Were these onions sound through or soft in the middle? The skill of buying honestly in a market where not every seller was operating on strict principles of transparency was genuine expertise, and a household servant who was bad at it cost the household money and waste, and in the need to resupply more frequently. Prices were negotiated. Fixed prices were less universal in medieval markets than the modern mind accustomed to price tags tends to assume. There was a customary price range for most goods. The just price was a concept discussed seriously in medieval economic theory. But within that range, the conversation between buyer and seller was expected, and a servant who simply paid whatever was asked first was considered either naive or wasteful, neither of which improved their standing with the steward. Specialist goods were sought in the right places. Spices came from the spice merchant, whose goods arrived from long international supply chains. Pepper from India via Italian trading cities, cinnamon from the eastern Mediterranean, nutmeg from the spice islands of what is now Indonesia. That pepper sitting in the merchant's bag on a market stall in a small English town had traveled more miles than anyone in a transaction would ever travel in their lifetime. This did not make it any cheaper. The return from market meant accounting. A report to the steward of what had been purchased, for how much, from whom. The steward compared this against the market prices he knew independently. Castle stewards gathered this information from multiple sources and assessed whether the purchasing had been done well. A servant who consistently overpaid, or who was suspected of skimming, of pocketing small amounts from the purchases, would not retain the privilege of the market run for long. The market errand was a position of relative trust, and relative trust in a medieval household had to be earned through demonstrated reliability. But for the hours it lasted, the walk to the town, the noise and color of the market, the brief conversations with sellers and passing strangers, the different air of a place where no one knew your rank or your household or your exact position in the social order, the market errand was a kind of freedom, small and bounded and temporary, but real. The castle, seen from outside the town as you walked back toward it with your purchases, looked different, larger, somehow more permanent, more like itself, a thing of stone and purpose and authority, sitting on its hill with the absolute confidence of a structure that had not been asked its opinion about whether it wanted to be there. You walked back through the gate. The porter nodded. The courtyard was the courtyard. The smell of the kitchen fire came to meet you like something familiar. You were home. You wake one morning and something is wrong. Not dramatically wrong. You are not lying unconscious in the great hall with a crowd of concerned faces looking down at you. You are simply unwell in a way that people in physically demanding occupations who sleep in cold, drafty spaces are periodically unwell. A sore throat, perhaps the early stages of something that might become a chest cold. Your joints ache. Your head is heavy. You feel the way a person feels when their body is processing something it did not enjoy. What happens next depends almost entirely on what is wrong with you, how wrong it is, and what resources your particular household makes available. Medieval medicine was not what we now call medicine in any recognizable clinical sense. It was a mixture of learned theory derived from ancient Greek sources, principally the humoral theory of the body developed by Galen and Hippocrates, transmitted through Arabic scholarship into Western European practice, and a vast body of empirical practical knowledge that had accumulated through centuries of observation, much of which was genuinely useful and some of which was not. The humoral theory held that the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good health was the balanced equilibrium of these 4 substances. Illness was an imbalance. and the task of the physician was to identify which humor was in excess or deficiency and to treat accordingly. Bloodletting, the controlled removal of blood from the patient, either by opening a vein with a lancet or by the application of leeches, was the most common medical intervention for a wide range of conditions, based on the principle that many illnesses resulted from an excess of blood. This sounds alarming to modern ears. And to be fair, in cases where the patient was already weakened, excessive bloodletting could and did make things considerably worse. But the theoretical framework was internally coherent, and the practice was backed by centuries of professional consensus, which is rather the definition of mainstream medicine at any given period. For servants in a large castle, access to trained medical care was better than for peasants outside the walls, if not quite as immediate as for the lord's own family. A large household might have a physician, a university-educated or at least trained doctor, on staff or on call. More commonly, medical needs were attended by the household's women, who maintained a store of practical medical knowledge and the physic garden to supply it. The lady of the castle or her senior ladies waiting often had substantial knowledge of herbal remedies and wound care that was passed down through female education and accumulated personal experience. Medieval women's medical knowledge is often underestimated by later scholarship, which tended to privilege the learned written tradition over practical oral and informal tradition. The practical tradition was extensive and in many areas genuinely effective. For minor ailments, the colds, the headaches, the joint pain, the cuts and bruises that were the inevitable consequence of physical work, herbal treatments formed the first line of response. Feverfew for headaches, chamomile or lemon balm as a calming drink for digestive distress, comfrey as a poultice for bruises and strained muscles, honey as an antimicrobial wound dressing, highly effective, as modern research has confirmed, because honey's low water content and acidic pH make it hostile to bacterial growth. The medieval herbalist didn't know the mechanism, but she knew that honey on a wound helped, because she had applied it many times and watched what happened. For more serious illness, the choice is narrowed. The physician, if available, might prescribe bloodletting purges, laxatives administered to clear an excess humor, or dietary restrictions designed to correct a humoral imbalance. The effectiveness of these treatments varied considerably by condition. For a genuine infection, neither bloodletting nor dietary change did much good in the meaningful sense, but the patient's immune system often resolved the matter anyway, and the treatment got the credit. For some conditions, fever management through rest and hydration, for instance, the recommended approach was closer to modern practice than medieval theory knew. Surgery existed. Medieval surgeons, distinct from physicians, who were generally university-educated theorists, while surgeons were often practical craftsmen who had learned by apprenticeship, could perform amputation, wound closure, the setting of broken bones, the treatment of abscesses, and a range of other physical interventions. Without anesthesia as we understand it, surgical procedures were performed with strong alcohol as a partial sedative, the surgeon working as quickly as possible while the patient was held down or restrained. This was not pleasant for anyone involved, but the results in competent hands were sometimes better than the modern prejudice against medieval surgery would suggest. A servant who became seriously ill was a problem for the household in a practical sense, as well as a human one. Their work needed covering. Their accommodation, which was tied to their employment, might become uncertain. Medieval employment did not include sick pay in any formal sense, though a well-run household would support a genuinely ill servant for a reasonable period rather than simply dismissing them to their fate. The size of this reasonable period depended on the generosity of the Lord, the value of the servant's skills, and the circumstances of illness. The women who managed the household's practical medical care were working from a knowledge base that was transmitted primarily through personal instruction and manuscript texts that circulated in vernacular languages by the 14th century. Books like the Trotula, a compilation of women's medicine texts that had been circulating in Europe since the 12th century, provided guidance on health matters that the university-educated physician's classical training sometimes neglected. Midwifery knowledge, wound care, the management of common complaints. These lived primarily in the practice of skilled women, and the castle's senior women held this knowledge in trust for the household. The relationship between official medical practice and practical household medicine was complementary rather than competing. A lord who fell seriously ill would send for a physician. A servant with a twisted ankle and a low fever would consult the dame who kept the physic garden. Both outcomes were handled. The castle was a complete system, and its medical response was proportionate to the situation, elaborate and expensive for the powerful, practical and herbal for everyone else. This is a pattern that will look familiar to anyone who has studied the history of healthcare in any era. Pain management was a real concern, addressed with the tools available. Strong wine or ale, administered before a painful procedure, provided partial sedation. Poppy-derived preparations, something in the family of opium, derived from the white poppy that was cultivated in medieval gardens, appear in medical texts as strong pain medicines. The dosing of these was an art rather than a science, and the record suggests that medieval practitioners were aware of the dangers of excess, even if they didn't understand the mechanism. Caution with strong medicines was advised in the texts and presumably practiced by careful healers. Whether the castle's amateur practitioners were always careful healers is a question that the records of the period answer with a mixture of hopeful silence and occasional very pointed case notes. You got better in this particular case. The sore throat resolved. You were back at work by the third day. You did not take any days off. You simply worked through it slightly more slowly, which was considered adequate. The bell rings at morning, at midday, at vespers, at Compline. It rings and the household pauses, adjusts, orients. The structure of the medieval day was not simply organizational. It was devotional. The canonical hours shaped time, and the shaping of time was an act of faith made visible in every schedule. The castle chapel was small, usually a rectangular stone room with an altar, a few religious images, the smell of incense and old candle wax and cold stone. In a large household, the chaplain held services daily, mass in the morning, perhaps brief offices at terce and none in vespers. Attendance at mass was expected, in principle, from the entire household, though the practical reality was that in a busy working castle, full attendance was an aspiration rather than a universal fact. Someone always had to be watching the kitchen fire. Someone always had to be minding the gate. The chaplain understood this. He was part of the household and understood the household's rhythms. For servants, the religious calendar was simultaneously a source of meaning and a source of days off, which in a working household amounted to nearly the same thing. Feast days, of which there were many in the medieval church calendar, around 40 to 50 days per year on which regular work was suspended in honor of a saint or a religious occasion, were genuinely experienced as holidays in the original sense of holy days. They were days when the pace slowed, when work was reduced to the necessary minimum, when there might be special food or ale, when the household gathered for communal activities in a more relaxed atmosphere than the working week allowed. Christmas. The 12 days of Christmas that ran from Christmas Day to Epiphany on January 6th was a great household festival when hospitality was extended generously, when food was plentiful and particularly good, when entertainers might be hired, when the normal hierarchy of the household relaxed slightly. There is a tradition, documented in some medieval sources, of the Lord of Misrule, a servant appointed to mock lead the Christmas festivities in a comedic inversion of the social order. This was managed and bound in misrule, a controlled safety valve, but reflected something genuine about the need for communities to occasionally acknowledge the arbitrariness of the hierarchies they otherwise maintain with total seriousness. Personal faith for a castle servant was expressed through the small private devotions of daily life, as much as through formal attendance at the chapel. Small personal crosses, devotional pendants, and prayer beads, rosaries, or their precursors, are found in the archaeological record across all social levels. People prayed privately, at morning and night, offering the brief personal invocations of faith that was not primarily a Sunday morning activity, but a continuous background presence in daily life. The concept of intercession, asking saints to mediate requests to God, was central to popular medieval religious practice. Every servant had a patron saint, the saint on whose feast day they'd been born, or the saint whose name they carried, or the saint whose particular domain of concern matched their needs or circumstances. Saint Blaise for throat ailments, Saint Nicholas for travelers and children, Saint Eligius for metalworkers, Saint Crispin for cobblers, Saint Wenceslas as a patron of those who serve others. The devotional economy of medieval saints was rich and specific, And a servant who had suffered a bad cut on a hand and said a prayer to Saint Sebastian was not engaging in superstition by their own understanding, but in a fully coherent and supported religious practice. The faith was real. The hope was real. In a life of considerable physical difficulty and limited economic agency, the devotional framework of medieval Christianity provided meaning, community, consolation for loss, and a conceptual architecture to understand suffering as something other than random pointlessness. Whether that framework accurately described the nature of the universe is a separate question that the 14th century was not primarily asking. In a community of 40 or 50 people living in close proximity, sharing resources, navigating a rigid hierarchy, and occasionally experiencing the stresses of hunger, cold, grief, and the specific frustrations of dependent labor, things went wrong. The most common form of misconduct in a medieval castle household was theft. This is not surprising. The castle contained things of value in a world where most people had limited access to things of value. Food was taken from kitchens, a piece of bread slipped under a tunic, an apple pocketed in the orchard, a small amount of ale drawn off from a barrel that the accounts might not miss. Small items disappeared. A length of rope, a tool, a candle. In a large household with complex accounting, small losses were occasionally attributed to miscounting or misplacement rather than deliberate taking, which created a small margin of tolerance for petty pilfering that the household accepted as an unavoidable cost of operation. When theft was discovered and attributed, and in a household where everyone knew everything about everyone, attribution was often easier than the thief had anticipated. The consequences varied by the severity and by the Lord's disposition. Minor theft might result in a beating and a warning, the combination designed to be both punitive and corrective. Repeated theft, or theft of significant value, could result in dismissal, which was a serious consequence in a world where your employment was also your food and your shelter. Outright dismissal from a Lord's service without reference meant finding employment in another household, and the reputation of a dismissed servant traveled through the social networks of noble households with considerable efficiency. Serious crimes, assault, serious theft, any accusation that touched on the Lord's honor or property in a significant way, were handled through the household court or, in serious cases, referred to the manor court or the public legal system. The Lord had genuine judicial authority over his household and, in many cases, over his estate tenants. This authority was not unlimited. The king's courts existed above it, but within its domain it was real. A lord who found his chamberlain had been systematically stealing from the household accounts over a period of years had legal remedies that went considerably beyond a sharp word. Violence between servants happened. Quarrels in the hall, arguments over sleeping space, the accumulated tensions of close living occasionally finding physical expression. The conduct manuals are notably concerned with table behavior, specifically with the imperative not to draw weapons in the hall, not to shout or quarrel at meals, not to strike a fellow servant in the presence of the Lord. These were not hypothetical concerns. They were addressing behaviors that occurred frequently enough to require explicit prohibition. The Lord's authority to punish was personal as well as legal. A lord could beat a servant. This was legally and socially permissible within certain limits. Excessive cruelty that damaged a servant's ability to work, or that was perceived as disproportionate by the standards of the time, might generate social criticism or legal complaint. But moderate physical discipline was considered within the normal range of a lord's authority over his household, in the same way that a parent had authority over a child. The power differential was real, legally embedded, and rarely seriously challenged from within. Running away was a theoretical option. For a serf, it was illegal and subject to pursuit and return. For a freeman, it was technically possible but practically difficult in a world where you needed food, shelter, and reference to find new employment, and where traveling alone as a person of known low status was not without its own dangers. Most servants stayed. Most managed. Most found, within the rigid framework of their situation, ways to make their lives workable. The relationship between a servant and a lord could, within the hierarchy, also contain genuine moments of human consideration that don't fit neatly into either the romantic or the cynical reading of medieval service. Some lords were, by the evidence of household accounts and contemporary testimony, genuinely concerned for the welfare of their people, providing care for sick servants, remembering the children of long-serving staff, marking the deaths of household members with appropriate ceremony. Others were not. The servant's experience of the power relationship depended very considerably on the character of the person at the top of it, which is a truth about institutional power that has not changed noticeably in the intervening 7 centuries. What the servant could not do within this structure was meaningfully appeal upward against a decision that had been made about them by the person above them in the chain. Except in cases of serious criminal misconduct, the Lord's judgment about his household was effectively final. You could leave if you were free. You could endure if you were not. You could, occasionally, find the small spaces within the system where a kind word, a demonstrated competence, a moment of genuine connection with a senior servant or a sympathetic member of the household, made the whole structure slightly more livable. People are remarkably good at finding those spaces. The medieval servants were no exception. The next guest is expected before noon. The table needs resetting. The hall fire is going low, and you are already moving toward the woodpile. The hierarchy is immovable. The work is endless, and the flagstones are cold to the soles of your shoes. But the fire will be warm when it's lit. The ale is good this week. And your colleague in the kitchen, the one who has worked here as long as you have and knows all the same stories, save you the end of the bread roll this morning, which was not required of her, and which you appreciated more than its size warranted. Small mercies. They are not nothing. And now you go back to work. Let us be fair to the medieval castle, and let us be fair to the people who lived in it. Life was hard, but people in hard lives find pleasure, and medieval servants were no exception. The small pleasures of castle servant life were real, and in some cases genuinely substantial. The feast days, which occurred roughly every 2 weeks on average of the year, were celebrated. Music in the medieval castle was not reserved for formal entertainment of guests. Servants sang at their work. This is documented in enough sources to be confident as a general practice. They sang in the kitchen, in the hall, in the stables. They played basic instruments, the tabor drum, the pipe, the simple fiddle. At Christmas and at Whitsuntide and at Midsummer, household celebrations included music and sometimes dancing, and these were experiences of genuine communal pleasure in which the distinctions of the daily hierarchy relaxed perceptibly. Games were played in the brief periods of leisure, dice games, ball games in the courtyard, board games like tables, and ancestor backgammon, and chess, which was not exclusively a noble game, but was enjoyed across a wider social range than is sometimes assumed. The castle grounds offered space for archery practice, which in medieval England was not only recreational but quasi-mandatory. Laws at various points in the medieval period required regular archery practice from able-bodied men, partly as a reserve of military capability. Storytelling and performance were forms of entertainment that required no equipment. The wandering entertainers, minstrels, jesters, acrobats, storytellers, who traveled between great houses and sometimes stayed for periods of weeks were genuinely welcomed, and their performances in the great hall on feast evenings were enjoyed by the whole household, high table and lower tables together, in one of the social moments when everyone was genuinely in the same experience at the same time. Food was a pleasure in itself when it was good. On feast days, the kitchen produced food that went beyond the daily baseline. Special dishes, better meat, sweet confections using honey and dried fruits. The servants ate better on feast days, and they knew it and they anticipated it. The rhythm of the year's eating, with its peaks and valleys defined by the church calendar and the agricultural season, gave food a meaning beyond simple nutrition. The Christmas goose, the Easter lamb, the harvest ale were all experiences embedded in time and memory, pleasures heightened by their specific seasonal occasion. And the community itself was a kind of pleasure. Life in close proximity to the same group of people produces the full range of human relationship, conflict and affection, rivalry and solidarity, occasional deep friendship. The women who worked together in the laundry for years developed friendships that are sometimes visible in medieval wills and court records, where people leave small bequests to colleagues or name them as witnesses, which requires both literacy at the level of the witness or at least social trust sufficient to ask. The grooms in the stable knew each other's horses and each other's habits. The kitchen staff worked as a team with a specific intimacy of people who had navigated the same difficult space together under the same difficult conditions for long enough that the working relationship had become personal. They had each other. In a life with few other resources, that was not a small thing. The specific texture of servant leisure is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it tends to be invisible in history written from perspective of records and documents, which, naturally, recorded the transactions and decisions and formal events of life more readily than they recorded someone sitting in a courtyard in May sunlight playing a game of dice with a colleague. Dice were extraordinarily common. They turn up in archaeological digs across the medieval period in quantities that suggest they were kept in pockets and pouches as a matter of personal habit. Made of bone or ivory, small carved cubes, sometimes with pips that were drilled and filled with lead to weight them toward a favorable number, which was cheating, but which was apparently a known enough practice that medieval regulations for fair games occasionally mention it. Dice were the immediate, portable, equipment minimal game for any spare 5 minutes. You could play them in a doorway. You could play them in the stable while waiting for a horse to finish eating. You played for small stakes, a penny, a bread roll, bragging rights of particularly worthless but satisfying medieval variety. Ball games in the castle courtyard were seasonal pleasures, the warmer months offering surfaces dry enough for the kind of energetic chasing and kicking that was the ancestor of modern football. The rules were loose by modern standards. What mattered was the playing of it, the combination of physical release and competitive enjoyment that is apparently a universal human technology for filling time and building community, observable in every culture that has ever existed and presumably in several that haven't been studied yet. Music was made with whatever instruments were at hand. The castle employed professional musicians for great occasions, but music in everyday servant life was participatory rather than performed. People sang. They sang the songs that everyone knew. Religious songs, work songs, love songs in the vernacular that circulated through the social networks of the period the way modern songs travel between people who share a cultural reference. The songs were not written down. They lived in memory and moved from person to person to the medium of one person singing and another person learning. This oral musical culture produced no manuscripts and very few historians, but was the actual sound of medieval daily life in a way that the carefully preserved liturgical music of the period was not. They had each other. In a life with few other resources, that was not a small thing. But there is a chapter of medieval life that cannot be avoided in a discussion of castle servants in the 14th century. A chapter that changed everything, and that touched the servants, who lived in close quarters, who handled the household's food and water, who traveled to market and touched everyone they encountered with particular ferocity. The Black Death reached England in 1348. It arrived first in the port towns of the south, Weymouth, Bristol, Southampton, carried on ships from the continent where it had already devastated the Mediterranean world. Within 2 years, it had moved north and east and west across the entire island, and when it was done, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the English population was dead. Some regions lost 2/3 of their inhabitants. Some villages disappeared entirely. The scale of it is difficult to conceptualize even with the advantage of historical distance. In a castle household, the plague's arrival was a catastrophe at every level. The disease, now understood to be primarily caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, spread primarily through the bite of infected fleas on rats, though also through respiratory transmission in its pneumonic form, did not respect the hierarchy of the household. It killed lords and servants alike, though the servants' living conditions, the shared sleeping spaces, the physical proximity, the constant contact with the rats that moved through every storage area of a medieval castle in considerable numbers, likely gave the pathogen more opportunities than the relatively more private quarters of the upper household provided. Symptoms of bubonic plague were specific and terrifying. The swollen, darkened lymph nodes called buboes that gave the disease its popular name, appearing in the armpit, groin, and neck within days of infection. Fever, delirium, the dark subcutaneous bleeding that gave it another name, the pestilence, or in some sources, the great mortality. Death typically came within 3 to 5 days of symptoms appearing. The survival rate without treatment was somewhere around 30 to 40%. Medieval medicine had no effective treatment because it had no understanding of the causative mechanism, and the prevailing explanations, corrupted air, divine punishment, the malign influence of planetary conjunction, could not produce interventions that meaningfully addressed the bacterium and the fleas. The response in castle household that survived the initial wave was quarantine in the approximate sense. Servants who developed symptoms were isolated from the rest of the household, though the mechanisms by which the disease was understood to spread primarily through air and contact, as medieval people conceived it, meant that the isolation measures taken were only partially effective. Flights to the countryside, lords and their households retreating to more isolated manors in hopes of escaping the plague's urban and trade route concentration, were a common response among those who had somewhere to flee. Servants traveled with them. After the Black Death, the world of castle servants changed permanently. The survivors found themselves in an economy where their labor was suddenly scarce. 1/3 to 1/2 of the workforce was gone. The lords who had survived needed servants. The servants who had survived had options. Wages rose, not immediately, and not without considerable legal resistance in the upper classes, who attempted through legislation like the Statute of Labours in 1351 to hold wages at pre-plague levels, but inexorably driven by the simple arithmetic of supply and demand. Villenage, serfdom, began its slow decline in part because serfs who ran away could find employment in short-handed towns and castles that were not asking too many questions about their legal status. The plague changed the servants' position in a way that no political movement or legal reform had managed. It made them, suddenly, economically valuable in a way that their lords could not ignore. By late afternoon, the light is failing. In the winter months, and January in a medieval English castle is very definitively winter. The sun was below the horizon by 4 o'clock, and the transition from daylight to artificial light was one of the defining events of the servants' day. Candles and torches were brought out and lit in the great hall. Torches and iron holders mounted on the walls supplemented the fire in the hearth. In private chambers, candlesticks held tallow candles that threw a warm but somewhat limited and slightly smoky light. The visual environment of a medieval castle after dark was nothing like the blazing artificial brightness of the modern world. It was warm-toned, flickering, dramatically shadowed. Faces across the hall were visible but not sharply. The corners of rooms disappeared into darkness. The light was enough to eat by, to work by in limited ways, to navigate by, but reading by candlelight was genuinely effortful, and fine detail work after dark was generally deferred to the morning. The evening meal, supper, was lighter and quieter than the midday dinner. Less ceremony, simpler food, bread and ale, perhaps some leftover pottage or cold meat, cheese. The assembly in the hall was smaller than a dinner. Some members of the household had retired. Some were occupied with evening tasks. The mood was quieter, the energy lower. The day was coming to its end. After supper came a period of managed winding down. The upper household retired first, the lord and lady to their solar, the senior servants to their various accommodations. The fires in the bedchambers were banked. Bed linens were turned down. Warming pans, long-handled metal devices filled with hot coals or heated stones, were run between the sheets to remove the cold before the lord or lady got into bed, because getting into a cold, damp medieval bed without prior warming was an experience that no one who had the option of preventing it chose to endure. Night watches needed to be set. A large castle maintained overnight security, not because attack was an everyday expectation in peacetime, but because a castle without overnight vigilance was a castle that had decided to trust to luck, and luck had a poor track record in the medieval period as a security strategy. Watchmen circulated the battlements and gatehouse through the night, changing watch at intervals. This was not a pleasant assignment in winter. The battlements were exposed to wind, the cold was unmitigated by any shelter, and the hours stretched long in the darkness. But it was a necessary function, and it was staffed by servants who drew this particular short straw in the rotation of household duties. Inside, as the upper household retired, the great hall once again transitioned into sleeping quarters. The floor pallets were laid out, the sleeping positions claimed by habit and seniority. The fire banked. The dogs settled in their places. The hall filled with the sounds of a building finding its nighttime rhythm. The creak of cooling timbers, the distant sound of watchmen's footsteps on the battlement, the occasional shifting of a horse in the stables. You found your place on the floor. The straw was familiar. The cold was familiar. The slight movement of the dog beside you, one of the lord's hunting dogs that had wandered over from a spot by the hearth and apparently decided your palate was a reasonable alternative, was familiar too. You scratch your arm. Old habit. You close your eyes. And in the darkness of the great hall, with the fire breathing its last orange light over the sleeping figures on the floor, you let the day go. Before sleep arrived, there was the brief private ceremony that ended every day, a prayer, not a formal liturgical performance. Those were for the chapel, for the chaplain, for the organized religious occasions of the household's public life. This was the private version, the kind offered under breath in the dark, the brief acknowledgement of gratitude or petition or simple recognition that the day was done and you were still in it. A lot of medieval people's private faith was conducted in exactly this register, informal, intimate, personal, without ceremony or witness. You thought, perhaps, about tomorrow. There was bread to be set rising before dawn, so it would be ready for the morning meal. There was a bridle strap that needed mending, noticed today and not dealt with today. There was a conversation you'd had with the undercook that afternoon, whose tone had been slightly off in a way that deserved some thought before it became something it needed to be addressed as. The ordinary concerns of an ordinary day. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that required immediate resolution. Things that the morning would take care of, because the morning always brought the capacity to take care of things if you arrived at it in reasonable shape. The fire settled. A log shifted with a quiet sound. The orange light moved across the ceiling. You were asleep before you finished the thought. Before sleep fully arrives, the castle speaks. This is something that no visitor, no guest, no lord surveying his domain from the solar ever hears the way a servant sleeping on the floor of the great hall hears it. The nighttime sounds of medieval castle are specific and layered, and after enough nights in the same hall, they become as familiar as the sounds of your own home. The fire settles. The logs shift as they burn down, and a small shower of sparks rises and fades. The sound is like a very quiet intake of breath. Then silent again, the particular textured silence of a large stone room. Not true silence, because silence in this era, before the constant mechanical hum of the modern world, is richer and more complex than modern ears easily perceive. You hear the building, the slight sound of air moving in the chimney louver, the faint creak of a timber in the roof, responding to temperature change, the scrape of a dog's leg as he scratches in his sleep. Distantly, from outside the curtain wall, an owl, then silence. The watches change somewhere around midnight. You are barely aware of it. A footstep, a murmur of voices as one watchman relieved another at the gate, then quiet again. The world outside the castle walls is dark and cold and essentially silent too, the countryside lying under whatever season's darkness has settled on it. Frost-hard and still in winter, soft and damp in autumn, thick with cricket sound in summer. The castle contains everyone who matters to your daily life. The lord you serve, the colleagues you work beside, the animals you have helped care for, the chaplain, asleep in his small chamber near the chapel, the cook, probably thinking about tomorrow's menu even in his sleep, because that is the kind of person who becomes the chief cook in a large medieval household. The grooms in the stable, closest to their horses in a way that people who love their work stay near it. You are part of this, a thread in this particular weaving, with a place and a function, and a weight in the fabric that would leave a visible gap if you weren't there. That is not a small thing to be. There is one more chapter of the servant's life that needs telling, and it is the hardest one, because people died in medieval castles, routinely and in circumstances that range from the dramatic to the quietly, simply sad. Life expectancy in the medieval period is one of those statistics that requires careful unpacking. The commonly cited figures, life expectancy at birth of 35 to 40 years, are significantly pulled down by high infant and child mortality. If a person survived childhood diseases, the years before 5 being particularly dangerous, and made it to adulthood, their likely remaining lifespan was considerably longer than the headline number suggests. Adults who reach 25 in reasonable health might reasonably expect to reach 50 or 60 if they avoided plague, serious injury, and a small number of other catastrophic events. But servants died at work. They died of infections that took hold too quickly for the physic garden to address. They died in accidents, falls from heights in building maintenance, burns in the kitchen, accidents involving horses in the stable, the various mishaps that attend physically demanding work performed in pre-safety regulation conditions. Women died in childbirth, which was the single greatest cause of death for women in the medieval period, at a rate that represented a genuine and constant background risk to every woman of reproductive age. They died in the great epidemics. Not just the Black Death, but the subsequent waves of plague that returned periodically through the later 14th and 15th centuries, each one smaller than the first, but still catastrophic by any reasonable measure. When a servant died, the household continued. This is a statement that sounds brutal, and is in its own way exactly that. The work of the castle did not pause for grief. The fires still needed lighting. The Lord still needed dressing. The horses still needed feeding. The human system that the household represented was resilient precisely because each function was expected to be filled by someone else. But the human response to death was also real. The religious framework of medieval life provided a structure for it. Prayers for the soul, mass offered for the dead. The community of the household gathered briefly to attend the burial in the churchyard of the local parish church that served the castle. If the servant had served long and well, the Lord might pay for the burial costs, might provide the few pennies needed for the priest's prayers, might note the death in the household accounts with a line that acknowledged the passing of someone the household would miss. Some household accounts of the 14th and 15th centuries record servant deaths with a sentence of what sounds like genuine regret, which tells us that the emotional life of the medieval household was not entirely a one-way transaction. The physical possessions of a dead servant were few. A will, if they left one, might dispose of a piece of clothing, a tool, a small coin, a personal devotional object. The medieval poor's wills, where they survive, have a poignant specificity. The blue woolen hood left to a sister, the frying pan left to a daughter, the small silver ring left to a colleague in the household. People did not have much. They gave what they had to the people they loved. The straw pallet was taken up from the place on the floor of the great hall where someone had slept for years. Another pallet appeared in its place. Another person learned to step on the kitchen stair that caught your foot if you weren't paying attention. The castle went on. It is a winter morning in the mid-14th century, before dawn, and the castle is just beginning to wake. If you could walk through it now, not as a servant with tasks and obligations and a hierarchy to navigate, but simply as an observer, moving quietly through the dark stone corridors with a full knowledge of everything you now know about this place and these people, what would you see? You would see the ruffle of 30 sleeping figures in the great hall, their breath faint in the cold air, the fire a red memory of itself. You would see the dogs, curled in the warmth, companionable in their absolute indifference to the night's cold. You would hear, somewhere in the upper reaches of the building, the sound of someone already awake, moving with purpose through a corridor with a candle, beginning the chain of small tasks that would bring the castle to life. You would see hands that are rough from cold water and lie. You would see shoes that have been worn past their best and have been repaired and worn further. You would see in the kitchen an organization of space that spoke of genuine competence and real skill. The tools of trade laid out with the quiet authority of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and has done enough times that it no longer requires conscious thought. You would see the daily negotiations of the social order, the careful choreography of who defers to whom, who precedes whom through a doorway, who speaks first and who waits. You would see people finding their pleasures in small places, a moment of warmth near the kitchen fire, a shared joke in the stable yard, the particular comfort of a bowl of morning pottage that is hot and filling, and, on this particular morning, flavor with a little extra bay leaf because someone in the kitchen was feeling generous. And you would see, if you were paying attention, something else. Something that is easy to miss from the outside, from the tourist vantage point, from the distance of 7 centuries. These people knew what they were doing. They were competent, skilled, and experienced in the specific expertise of the life they lived. They understood their castle way only people who live and work somewhere intimately understand it. They navigated a world of considerable difficulty with the practical intelligence of people who did not have the option of finding it too difficult. Their lives were hard in ways that are genuinely difficult to romanticize. The cold was real. The exhaustion was real. The constrained choices were real. The fleas were very real. The legal subjugation of many of them was real, with consequences that were not abstract but daily and physical. And their dignity was also real. Not the dignity of ease or comfort or power, but the dignity of competence, of function, of belonging to something larger than oneself, of knowing that the fires burned because you lit them and the Lord's household ran, because you made it run and the horses were fed and the linen was clean and the bread was baked, and the children of the household were not going hungry tonight. History remembers the lords and the wars and the documents that changed the shape of kingdoms. The servants wrote fewer documents and generally did not change the shape of kingdoms, but they kept the world turning one morning at a time, in the cold dark before anyone else was awake, and they deserve to be remembered for it. That is where we will leave them tonight, in the great hall, settling into their rest, the fire breathing quietly beside them, the castle watching over the dark countryside beyond its walls. 700 years ago, someone lay down on a straw pallet on a cold stone floor and closed their eyes exactly as you're closing yours now. They had worked since before sunrise. Their back ached and their hands were rough, and somewhere in the straw a flea was conducting its affairs with characteristic disregard for anyone's comfort. But they were part of something. They had done the work of the day. The fires were banked. The horses were fed. The hall was ready for morning. And outside the curtain wall, in the absolute dark of the medieval night, the stars were the same stars. Sleep well. I'll see you next time. Thank you for spending this time with Boring History for Sleep. If you enjoyed this journey through the Castle Servant world, please like this video and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Drop your location in the comments. Tell me where in the world you listen from tonight. And if there's a historical period or a particular corner of daily life you would like to explore next, I always want to hear from you. The door to the past is always open. All you have to do is walk through it.